inside a crowded market, a little girl made a small, desperate gesture, one that only a trained eye could notice. A police officer caught it instantly and decided to follow her all the way to her home. What he discovered there would change everything. Before we get started, drop a comment below and let us know where you're tuning in from. Now, let's dive into the story. The supermarket was buzzing with the usual hum of daily life. The kind of quiet chaos that always seemed to surround the aisles, with people casually strolling, pushing their carts, searching for items, and making small talk with friends or strangers alike. It was a place that, for the most part, didn't seem to change. The lighting was always the same: sterile, fluorescent, and slightly too bright. The shelves were stocked with familiar brands, their labels lining the walls like a well-organized army awaiting the next consumer to reach out and grab them. Ethan had been here many times before, walking these same aisles, doing his rounds as part of his patrol. It had become part of the routine, a predictable, almost comforting experience. Every Tuesday and Thursday, without fail, he would walk into the store as part of his daily responsibilities, exchanging pleasantries with the manager, nodding at regular customers, and making sure everything was running smoothly. He was a man of habit. His life, up until that point, had been about consistency, calm, and predictability. At 33, Ethan had come to accept that most days would be like this. Quiet, without drama, just another drop in the ocean of mundane encounters. In the hustle of everyday life, nothing ever seemed out of place. But then something happened. A small movement caught his eye. He almost missed it, almost brushed it off as nothing more than a child playing with her hands, maybe just another bored kid hanging out with a parent on a trip to the supermarket. But that would have been a mistake, one that could have changed everything. There, in the middle of aisle 12, among the cereal boxes and shelves of snacks, stood a little girl. At first glance, she seemed like any other child, small, blonde, with a teddy bear clutched tightly to her chest. Her dress, once pink, had faded to a dull shade, and her hair, tangled and messy, looked like it hadn't been brushed in a while. She appeared fragile, vulnerable, but nothing about her screamed for attention. There was no loud tantrum, no overt signs of distress. She was just standing there, next to a tall man, someone Ethan didn't recognize, with dark hair and tattoos running down his arms. The man was busy scanning the shelves, his attention clearly elsewhere, completely unaware of what was unfolding. Ethan, however, couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. His instincts kicked in, despite his usual inclination to blend into the background. It wasn't the man's presence that bothered him. No, it was something far more subtle. It was the little girl's hand. The movement, small but deliberate, was unmistakable. A gesture that, to most people, would have gone unnoticed. It was a signal, a silent cry for help. Her palm was facing out, her thumb tucked in, and her fingers slowly folding down, only to open again in the blink of an eye. It was a movement so subtle that, on any other day, he might have missed it entirely. But Ethan had been trained to recognize these signals, to understand their meaning. He had seen it before in department briefings about child safety. It was a silent distress signal, one used by children who couldn't ask for help in words, but could convey their need with a simple hand motion. It wasn't something you learned from textbooks. It wasn't something you heard in a lecture. It was the kind of thing that lived in your gut, an understanding that told you when something was wrong, even if nothing seemed out of place. His heart raced. That gesture, that tiny movement, had set off alarm bells in his mind. The man next to her seemed oblivious, his focus fixed on the cereal boxes in front of him. His eyes didn't flicker in the girl's direction, not once. But the girl, there was something in her eyes. It wasn't fear, not the panic that one might expect from a child in danger. No, it was something quieter, something far more unsettling. It was a kind of hope, the kind you have when you send a message out into the world, hoping that someone, anyone, will hear it. Her eyes met Ethan's for just a moment, a fleeting glance, but in that split second, something passed between them. Something deep, something urgent. She didn't have to speak. She didn't have to scream. Her eyes did the talking. Her message was clear: I need help. Ethan's instinct screamed at him to act, but he had to fight the urge to rush in, to run toward her, to scoop her up and make sure she was safe. He knew better. He had learned, over the years, that jumping to conclusions was dangerous. It could be nothing. It could be something as harmless as a child playing with her hands. There was always that chance. He let out a slow breath and pretended to check his phone, all the while keeping his eyes fixed on the little girl. He wanted to see more, to understand the depth of what he was witnessing. His gaze lingered on her, watching the way she tightened her grip on the teddy bear, how her small fingers seemed to curl around it protectively. She glanced around nervously as if looking for someone or something, but when her eyes landed on him, there was no question in his mind. She was scared. The man beside her spoke, his voice a steady monotone. "Come on, Lily," he said, a calmness in his tone that didn't match the tension Ethan felt. The little girl looked down at the floor, instantly shrinking away from the man's touch, as though she knew that her world had changed the moment she made that signal. It was as though her fear had been acknowledged, and now she was waiting for someone to do something about it. Ethan stood there for a moment longer, his mind racing. Was he reading too much into this? Was he seeing things that weren't there? The hand gesture could have been completely innocent. Maybe she was just playing. Maybe he was overreacting, making a situation out of nothing. But the look in her eyes, the way she gripped that bear, the way she looked at him like she was holding on to the last thread of hope she had left, told him otherwise. He wasn't overreacting. His gut was telling him that something was wrong. And so he followed. At first, he kept his distance, trailing behind them without drawing attention. The supermarket, for all its normalcy, had suddenly become a place filled with hidden danger. The little girl, who had once seemed like just another child in the store, now felt like the most important person in the world. He couldn't explain it, but he knew. He couldn't let her slip away. He couldn't let this be one of those moments when someone's subtle cry for help goes unheard. As they walked toward the checkout line, Ethan pretended to shop, all the while keeping an eye on the pair. The man and the girl moved ahead, the girl clutching her teddy bear as though it was her only lifeline, her silent signal hanging in the air, unanswered. The world outside seemed to go on as usual, the hum of the registers, the shuffle of feet on linoleum. But Ethan knew that for him, everything had just changed. Something was wrong, and it was up to him to figure out exactly what. Ethan had been a police officer for over a decade, and in many ways, his daily routine had become second nature to him. His mornings typically started the same way, with a cup of black coffee in hand and the usual briefing at the precinct where officers exchanged updates on any noteworthy incidents. After that, he would make his rounds through the city, checking in at various locations as part of his patrol. For the most part, his days followed a predictable rhythm. He was assigned to oversee the area around the downtown shopping district, which included the supermarket he'd visited countless times. The customers were familiar faces, the shelves stocked in their usual places, and the general atmosphere of the town was calm, with little more than the occasional noise, complaint, or minor traffic issue to address. Nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary, and Ethan had learned to find a certain comfort in the monotony. His patrols were not the kind of heroic, high-adrenaline situations that movies often portrayed. They were, for the most part, quiet and uneventful. Ethan had accepted that the bulk of his job was about maintaining order, making sure everything ran smoothly without drawing attention. His role was to blend into the background, a steady presence in a town that mostly took its peace for granted. The grocery store was a perfect example of this routine. It was part of his regular check-ins, a stop he made twice a week, not because there was ever a real threat, but because the store manager, Pete, appreciated having an officer nearby. Ethan would make small talk with the staff, nod to the familiar faces of the regular customers, and ensure the aisles remained safe and calm. Over time, these visits had become ingrained in his day-to-day life, a predictable break in the rhythm of his work. But that predictability was exactly what made it so easy to overlook the details, the small, often invisible moments that could suddenly shift everything. Ethan had become accustomed to the idea that most of his work was simply about making sure nothing went wrong, And that was exactly how he liked it. That was until in the middle of aisle 12, his usual routine was disrupted by something small yet profoundly significant. It was a moment so subtle that had it not caught his eye, it would have slipped by unnoticed. But once he saw it, everything changed. The calm and predictability he had come to rely on were no longer enough. Something had been set into motion, and it would be up to him to figure out what it meant. Ethan had walked down this same aisle countless times. It was familiar ground, aisle 12, the cereal section. The shelves were stacked with the usual boxes of cornflakes, granola, and oat bran. The scene was as mundane as any other in the store. Nothing stood out. But then there was the little girl. She wasn't the only child in the store, but something about her drew Ethan's attention, pulling him out of the rhythm of his patrol. She was standing next to a tall man, her small frame barely reaching his waist. She was quiet, still, with an expression that felt oddly out of place. The girl had blonde hair, disheveled and untidy, and her faded pink dress looked like it had seen better days. She was clutching a teddy bear, the kind of worn-out toy that was more comfort than a plaything. Her eyes were fixed on the ground, and her body language screamed hesitation. There was nothing outwardly alarming about the situation, nothing that would immediately raise concern for an ordinary observer. But Ethan wasn't just an ordinary observer. His job was to notice the things that others overlooked, to read between the lines, to catch the subtle signals that most people would miss. And in this case, something didn't sit right with him. The man beside her, whom Ethan could only assume was her guardian, was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket with sleeves that barely covered the tattoos on his arms. He was scanning the cereal boxes with casual disinterest, picking through the brands with an almost mechanical detachment. His face was unreadable, his attention fixed on the shelf in front of him, but his posture was relaxed, almost too relaxed for someone accompanying a child. His presence didn't stand out in any significant way, not at first. But that's where the dissonance began. Ethan found it difficult to shake the feeling that there was something amiss in the way the man held himself. He wasn't paying attention to the girl, not in a protective or fatherly way. The kind of care that one might expect a parent or guardian to exhibit was absent from his demeanor. The man's indifference didn't match the girl's tension. And then Ethan saw it. The signal. The gesture, so subtle that it might have been missed by anyone not looking for it. The girl's hand, ever so slightly, shifted into position. Her palm faced out, her fingers curling inward, then slowly folding down before opening again. It was quick, barely noticeable, but unmistakable to someone trained to recognize such signs. Ethan's training in child safety flashed through his mind in that instant. It was the silent distress signal, a gesture designed for situations like this, when words weren't possible, when help was needed but could not be asked for directly. He had seen it in department briefings, discussed in seminars, but he had never expected to witness it in person. It was a signal of need, a plea for help. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. His gaze lingered on the girl for a moment longer, trying to process what he had just seen. She wasn't looking at him anymore. Her eyes were still, downcast, her grip on the teddy bear tightening as though she was drawing strength from it. But in that fleeting moment when their eyes had met earlier, Ethan had seen the same desperation in her gaze. It wasn't panic, it wasn't fear, it was something quieter, more internal. It was a look of silent desperation, the kind that comes from knowing you need help, but not knowing how to ask for it. It was the kind of look that makes someone feel invisible. And that look, paired with the hand gesture, cemented his growing suspicion that something was very wrong. But then came the first internal conflict. Was he reading too much into it? Could he be misinterpreting a child's innocent fidgeting as something much darker? The gesture was subtle, and the girl had made no other outward sign that something was amiss. She could be playing, could just be nervous or bored. A child in a mundane, repetitive situation. Was he overreacting? He thought of the countless times he had walked through this store, his eyes skipping over similar scenes without a second thought. A child with a teddy bear, a man with tattoos, both of them standing there perfectly ordinary. And yet, everything about this felt different. His gut told him something was off. The man had placed his hand on the girl's shoulder, a brief touch, but Ethan noticed how she immediately looked down, her shoulders tensing. She didn't react like a child who was simply tired or uncomfortable. She reacted like someone trying to escape, someone who had learned to make themselves as small as possible in the presence of someone who didn't have their best interests at heart. There was a shift in Ethan's gut, a feeling that started deep within him and slowly worked its way up. His instincts were telling him not to ignore this, not to let it go. As the man continued to browse the shelves, oblivious to the growing tension between them, Ethan found himself grappling with the question. Was he overreacting, or was he seeing something that others might overlook? It would have been so easy to turn away, to chalk it up to a figment of his imagination. But there was something in the girl's eyes that told him otherwise. Something in the way she clung to that teddy bear, as if it was her only source of comfort. Something in the way she looked around the store, as if she was looking for a lifeline. Something familiar, something safe. The conflict raged in his mind. On one hand, it could be nothing. A child simply trying to pass the time in a grocery store, making shapes with her hands, seeking some small distraction from the monotony of the day. But on the other hand, the gesture she had made, so quick and deliberate, couldn't be ignored. His training told him it wasn't a coincidence. His heart told him it wasn't a simple child's game. The disconnect between the girl's fear and the man's indifference felt like a red flag, and Ethan couldn't let it go. He exhaled slowly, his mind running through all the possibilities, weighing the options. Was this really worth the risk of making a scene? Was it worth it to approach them? To step into a situation that might be far more complicated than it appeared? Or would he simply be overreacting and causing unnecessary trouble? The more he thought about it, the more he realized he had no choice. His instincts were telling him that the subtle gesture wasn't just a cry for help, it was a sign that something was wrong, something that needed to be investigated. Without fully realizing it, Ethan had made up his mind. He would follow them at a distance, keeping his presence unnoticed. He would trust his instincts and see where they led him. The subtle sign, the girl's quiet plea, had sparked something in him, something he couldn't ignore. And so, as they continued down the aisle, moving toward the checkout line, Ethan remained behind, watching, waiting for the next step. He couldn't turn away now. He had seen enough to know that whatever this was, it was worth pursuing. The subtle signal had set everything in motion, and he wasn't about to let it slip by. Ethan's heart raced as he followed them through the aisles, the sound of his shoes softly hitting the floor blending with the distant chatter of shoppers around him. The supermarket, which had once seemed like an ordinary space, now felt alien, as if it had become a setting for something far more urgent than just grocery shopping. His focus remained fixed on the little girl, Lily, whose subtle signal had already set off an alarm in his mind. The man she was with was unaware of his watchful gaze, walking ahead with the same casual indifference he had displayed since they entered the store. But for Ethan, every step felt like a calculated decision, the weight of his own instincts pressing on him with each passing moment. He tried to push back the feeling of unease that was steadily growing inside him. His years on the force had taught him to rely on evidence, not just gut feelings. But this was different. He had been trained to recognize the signs of danger, the body language, the nervous glances, the small, seemingly insignificant gestures that could speak volumes when read correctly. Lily's hand movement in aisle 12 hadn't been a fluke. It hadn't been a mistake or a child's innocent fidget. It was deliberate. It was a call for help, one that, in all likelihood, no one else would have noticed. As they moved toward the front of the store, Lily's behavior remained strikingly consistent. She hadn't spoken a word, hadn't even glanced up from the ground as they made their way through the aisles. The teddy bear was still clutched tightly in her small hands, the worn fabric a sign of how much it meant to her. Ethan couldn't help but feel a deep sense of empathy for the child. He had seen children in difficult situations before, but something about the way Lily held herself was different. There was a stillness about her, a quiet that spoke volumes. She wasn't panicked, but she was desperate, a desperation that even without the ability to speak, seemed to seep through every inch of her small frame. Her shoulders were slightly hunched, as if she was trying to make herself smaller, to blend in, to avoid being noticed. But Ethan had noticed her, and now he couldn't look away. He kept his distance, pretending to scan the shelves for his own shopping, but his eyes were locked on the pair in front of him. The man, oblivious to Ethan's presence, continued walking, his pace steady and unhurried. There was nothing remarkable about him. No signs of aggression, no overt red flags. But Ethan couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong. The man's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the tension radiating from Lily. It didn't make sense. If this was simply a father and daughter, why was she so distant, so withdrawn? Why did she seem so fearful, even in a place as public and open as a supermarket? Ethan couldn't answer those questions, but his instincts told him he didn't need answers yet, he just needed to act. He glanced around casually, trying to assess the situation without drawing attention to himself. Other shoppers were oblivious to what was unfolding, each caught up in their own routines, their own mundane tasks. No one was paying attention to the girl standing in aisle 12, clutching her teddy bear and looking as if she were waiting for someone to rescue her. Ethan's heart tightened as he realized that no one else was going to help her, at least not unless he did something about it. He couldn't afford to ignore this. They moved toward the checkout line, and Ethan knew that he had to make a choice. He could let them leave the store, convincing himself that it was nothing, that it was all in his head. Or he could follow through on what his instincts were telling him and see this through. He had no concrete evidence, no proof that anything was amiss, but his gut was screaming at him to do something. He had never been the kind of officer to make assumptions based on nothing, but this felt different. The signal, the look in Lily's eyes, they were telling him a story he couldn't ignore. And as they neared the checkout, he made up his mind. He would follow them, keep them in sight, and see where it led. His footsteps slowed as they approached the counter, trying to remain as inconspicuous as possible. The cashier smiled at Lily, complimenting her teddy bear, but the girl didn't respond. She didn't even look up. It was as though the world around her had faded away, leaving her trapped in her own bubble of fear and uncertainty. Ethan's chest tightened as he watched the exchange. The man, still nonchalant, paid for their items and turned to leave, placing his hand on Lily's shoulder once again. She didn't look at him. She didn't react. She simply followed, her steps slow and hesitant. Ethan watched them move toward the exit, his heart pounding in his chest. His mind raced as he processed everything he had observed. Should he approach them now? Should he intervene? He wasn't sure what he would say, what he would do. He only knew that he couldn't let them leave the store without making sure the little girl was safe. But what if he was wrong? What if this was all a misunderstanding, a child simply in need of a moment of quiet? What if he was overstepping, making something out of nothing? These doubts swirled in his mind, but they weren't enough to stop him. He couldn't shake the feeling that Lily needed someone to notice her, to see her, to make sure she wasn't left behind. The automatic doors slid open and the cool air of the outside world hit him. He followed them into the parking lot, maintaining a safe distance. The sound of his footsteps on the pavement seemed distant, muffled by the chaos of his thoughts. They walked toward a beat-up blue sedan parked near the back of the lot, away from the other cars. Ethan's pulse quickened as he kept his distance, watching every move they made. The man opened the passenger door for Lily, who hesitated just for a moment. It was brief, a second, maybe two, but it was enough. The way she looked back toward the store, as if hoping someone would follow, was unmistakable. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. That brief pause, that fleeting glance, spoke volumes. She was scared. She wanted help, but she didn't know how to ask for it. The man's voice carried across the parking lot, sharp and commanding. "Lily, get in the car now," he said, his tone not threatening but firm. She obeyed immediately, climbing into the seat and clutching her teddy bear even tighter. Ethan's gut told him that this was the moment. He had to act. His mind flashed back to his training, to the lessons he had learned about child safety, about trusting his instincts when something didn't feel right. This wasn't just a child being shy or anxious. This was something more. He reached for his radio, his fingers trembling slightly as he made the call. Unit 47, I'm following up on a possible situation involving a minor. Requesting backup for observation only. His voice was steady, but inside his emotions were swirling. He wasn't sure what was going to happen next, but he knew that he couldn't let this moment pass him by. This wasn't just another routine check. This was the moment that could change a life, the moment where he would either act or let something slip away. As the car pulled out of the parking space, Ethan kept his distance, his eyes never leaving the sedan. He stayed several cars behind, keeping a steady but careful pace. The sun, which had been shining brightly just moments ago, now seemed harsh and unforgiving. Ethan's hands gripped the steering wheel as he followed them down the road. He was beginning to realize that this wasn't just another day in the life of a police officer. This was a moment of reckoning, one where the stakes were higher than anything he had faced in a long time. His instincts had led him this far, and now he had to see it through. He couldn't turn back. Not now. The car moved through the downtown streets, its pace slow and unhurried. Ethan's mind raced with possibilities, the tension in his chest tightening with every passing block. His eyes flicked from the road to the blue sedan, the glint of sunlight reflecting off the rearview mirror. He wasn't sure where this road would lead, but he knew one thing. He wasn't about to let Lily slip away unnoticed. Not again. Ethan's mind raced, the weight of his decision pressing on him like a heavy stone. He had to act, but what if he was wrong? What if he had misread the signs, let his instincts take over when logic should have prevailed? The internal conflict gnawed at him as he continued to follow the man and the little girl, the supermarket's bright fluorescent lights flickering above him like a constant reminder of the world he was trying to make sense of. As he walked, Ethan couldn't help but replay the moment in aisle 12 over and over in his mind. The subtle signal, the hand gesture, the glance they had shared, it was all still fresh in his memory, but now as he trailed behind them, doubt began to creep in. Could it be nothing? Was he overthinking it? What if he was just another officer making mountains out of molehills? He couldn't help but wonder whether he was falling victim to his own paranoia. His thoughts were interrupted by a quick exchange between the man and a cashier near the front of the store. The little girl, still clutching her teddy bear, stood silently by the register, her eyes never once meeting the cashier's gaze. The man spoke in a casual tone, as if the world around him didn't matter, as if his attention was entirely on the items in his hands. "That's a cute bear she's got there," the cashier remarked, her voice light and friendly, as though she was engaging in a normal conversation. The man barely looked up. "Yeah, she likes it. Keeps her quiet." Ethan's stomach churned at the man's words. The casual dismissal of his daughter, the nonchalant comment about keeping her quiet, felt off. There was no love in the way he spoke, no tenderness, nothing that suggested any genuine concern for the child standing next to him. Ethan watched the girl's face closely, her small frame trembling ever so slightly, her fingers tightening around the teddy bear as if it were her only anchor to the world. She didn't respond to the cashier's compliment, didn't even acknowledge it. Instead, she continued to stare down at her feet, her body language all but screaming that she wanted to disappear. The contrast between the girl's silence and the man's indifferent attitude sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. The girl's quietness wasn't normal for a child her age. It wasn't shyness or embarrassment. It was something deeper, something more unsettling. The officer's gaze flickered back and forth between the little girl and the man, trying to make sense of the situation, to piece together what he had observed. But the more he watched, the more certain he became that something wasn't right. As the man finished paying for their groceries, Ethan's mind continued to spin. He tried to push aside the rising tension in his chest, tried to force himself to remain objective, but it was impossible. The more he thought about it, the more he realized he had seen this before, in the subtle signs, in the way children sometimes behaved when they were trapped in difficult situations. It wasn't the first time he had come across someone like this, someone who wore a facade of normalcy but hid something much darker beneath the surface. But there was something about this case, about this little girl, that felt different. The man turned away from the register, grabbing the grocery bags with one hand, motioning for the little girl to follow. She obeyed immediately without protest, her small feet barely making a sound on the floor as she walked behind him. Ethan couldn't tear his eyes away. The girl's expression remained unchanged, her eyes cast downward as if she were trying to shrink away from the world around her. Her teddy bear, a simple object in the hands of a child, had become something far more significant in that moment. A symbol of comfort, of safety, of the only thing that seemed to offer her any sense of security. Ethan followed at a distance, careful not to draw attention to himself. He remained hidden among the other customers, pretending to examine a few items on the shelves, all while keeping the pair in his peripheral vision. He could hear the soft murmur of voices around him, the steady clink of coins being exchanged. But none of it mattered. The world had narrowed down to the little girl and the man, to the unspoken tension between them, to the silent plea for help that Ethan was certain only he could see. As they approached the exit, the man casually spoke to the little girl, his voice low and almost dismissive. "Come on, Lily. We're done here." Lily didn't respond. She didn't look up. She simply walked beside him, her grip on the teddy bear still firm and tight. Ethan's heart broke a little more with each step they took. He could feel the girl's silent fear, her resignation, as if she had already accepted that no one would come for her, that no one would notice the small, subtle signs that screamed for attention. He couldn't let it happen. He couldn't let her slip away. They reached the automatic doors, and the man stepped outside, his posture still relaxed, his back turned to the world as he led Lily toward the car. Ethan stayed behind, his pulse quickening as he watched them leave the store. He had to make a decision now or never. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, walking briskly toward the exit. But just before he could cross the threshold, something stopped him. It was the briefest of moments, but it was enough. Lily had turned her head, just slightly, glancing back at the store as if searching for someone, anyone, who might notice her. The briefest flicker of hope, of expectation, passed through her eyes before they quickly shifted back down to her feet. It was the smallest of gestures, barely perceptible, but it was all Ethan needed to see. She was waiting for someone to follow. She was hoping that someone, anyone, would recognize the silent cry for help. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He knew, without a doubt, that this was the moment. He couldn't turn away now. He couldn't let this chance slip through his fingers. The girl was waiting for him, and he wasn't about to let her down. He pushed through the automatic doors and stepped into the parking lot, keeping a safe distance between himself and the man and the girl. His instincts had led him this far, and now he would follow them to the end. He wasn't sure what he would find, what would happen next, but he knew one thing. He couldn't ignore this any longer. The stakes had just become too high. As they approached a beat-up blue sedan parked near the back of the lot, Ethan's thoughts raced. His hand hovered near his radio, ready to make a call if things went sideways, but he kept moving, following them, watching. The sun had started to dip behind the buildings, casting long shadows across the parking lot. The world felt heavier, as if time itself had slowed down, each second dragging on as he moved closer to the pair. The man opened the passenger door for Lily, who hesitated for just a moment before getting in. It wasn't a long pause, but it was enough. It was a signal that Ethan had already seen too many times before in his career. The girl was waiting for someone to act. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt the weight of his decision settle on him. He wasn't overreacting. He wasn't imagining things. This was real, and he had to act. As Ethan followed the man and the little girl through the parking lot, the tension in his chest seemed to grow with each step they took. His gaze flicked between the pair, focusing on the little girl, whose every movement seemed to hold a deeper meaning, while also tracking the man who appeared completely unaware of the quiet drama unfolding just a few feet away. From his vantage point, he could see the bigger picture starting to take shape, the puzzle pieces falling into place, but it was a picture that didn't quite make sense. There was something about the man's casual demeanor, his indifference to the girl's fearful behavior that felt wrong, and the girl's silent anxiety only added to that discomfort. The girl, who had barely spoken a word since Ethan first noticed her, was the focal point of his attention. He could see how her small frame trembled slightly, how her grip on her teddy bear remained tight, her knuckles white from holding it so fiercely. Her body language screamed tension even as she moved obediently beside the man. Her eyes, though often downcast, would dart around occasionally as if searching for something, someone perhaps. She was alert in a way that a child shouldn't have to be, especially in such an open and public space. The way she walked, her steps hesitant and careful, revealed that she was deeply aware of her surroundings, constantly scanning for potential danger, or perhaps for someone who might offer her a way out. Ethan's heart ached for her. He couldn't help but imagine what was going on inside her mind. Was she used to this? Was she resigned to the fact that she had no control over her own life? The way she clung to the teddy bear, as though it were her only source of comfort in a world that had perhaps grown too frightening for her to navigate alone, told him that this wasn't just a simple case of a child being shy. There was more at play here. The girl wasn't just afraid of something she couldn't articulate. She was afraid of something real, something she had learned to fear long before she could understand the full extent of it. But then there was the man, the figure who seemed to be the source of her distress. Ethan couldn't make sense of him. At first glance, he appeared to be a normal enough adult, tall, with dark hair and tattoos that suggested a rough edge, the kind of man who might intimidate the casual observer. He moved with a calmness that bordered on indifference, a stark contrast to the nervous energy that radiated from the girl. There was nothing outwardly threatening about him, nothing that screamed danger or malice. He was just going about his business, as if he had every right to be there with the girl, as if she were just another child, another responsibility. Yet, as Ethan watched him more closely, he began to pick up on subtle cues that told a different story. The way the man's eyes never seemed to meet the girl's, how he barely interacted with her at all, aside from occasional command or casual touch. The lack of warmth, the absence of any protective instinct, made it clear that something wasn't right. If this man was her father or guardian, why did he seem so disengaged from her well-being? Why didn't he offer any comfort when she stood there, holding her teddy bear as though it were her lifeline? The small actions, or lack thereof, spoke volumes to Ethan. The man's indifference, his emotional distance, was starting to paint a picture of someone who might not have the child's best interests at heart. The more Ethan observed, the more he began to feel that the man's apparent calmness was masking something much darker. Ethan's instincts told him that the girl was in danger, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the man's coldness was part of the problem. Was he simply a negligent caregiver, or was there something more sinister at play here? The man's lack of concern for the girl's emotional state was troubling. The way he barely acknowledged her as they moved through the store, the way he simply directed her without any sign of affection or reassurance, made Ethan wonder if the girl had learned to keep quiet, to avoid drawing attention to herself in order to stay out of harm's way. The more Ethan thought about it, the more convinced he became that the little girl's silent signal had been a cry for help. And the man, far from being a protector, was likely the one who had put her in a position where she felt the need to ask for help in such a subtle, quiet way. As Ethan continued to follow them, he started to realize that the bigger picture was more complex than he had initially thought. He was no longer just watching a man and a child. He was witnessing a dynamic, a relationship that was far from ordinary. The girl's body language told him that she was trying to navigate a world where she had no control, where the person she was supposed to trust most was someone who might be failing her in ways that were invisible to the outside world. The man's detached attitude, his complete lack of concern for the emotional well-being of the child, was like a flashing red light, warning him that something was terribly wrong. But as he stepped back to take in the full picture, he realized that there was even more at play here. The little girl's behavior wasn't just about fear, it was about survival. It was about a child who had learned, perhaps too early, that the world was a place where trust could be broken, where safety could be fleeting, and where the only way to get by was to stay under the radar. She had learned to keep quiet, to hide her emotions, to appear as though everything was fine even when it wasn't. Ethan couldn't help but think of all the other children out there, children who, like her, were trapped in situations they couldn't escape from, children who had learned to hide their pain behind quiet smiles and unspoken gestures. How many other kids, just like Lily, had gone unnoticed, their cries for help drowned out by the noise of the world. Ethan's role in this moment, in this picture, was clearer than ever. He was the one who had noticed. He was the one who had seen the small signal, the tiny movement that could have easily been dismissed as a harmless gesture. He was the one who had chosen not to ignore it, not to assume that everything was fine simply because nothing looked out of place. His job in this moment was more than just protecting and serving. It was about seeing the invisible, hearing the silent cries that others missed, and understanding that sometimes the most important signs are the ones that aren't shouted from the rooftops. As they reached the car, Ethan found himself struggling to make sense of everything he had just observed. The situation had become more complicated than he had expected, and the more he pieced the details together, the clearer it became that he had to act. He had to trust his instincts, trust that what he had seen wasn't a fluke, that the little girl's fear wasn't just an overreaction. He knew that he couldn't turn back now, that he had a responsibility to follow through, even if it meant taking a risk. The stakes were too high, and the truth, whatever it was, had to be uncovered. He stepped forward, his radio already in his hand, ready to make the call. This wasn't just about watching them anymore. It was about ensuring the girl's safety, making sure that her silent plea for help didn't go unanswered. The bigger picture was slowly coming into focus, and it was up to him to make sure that this little girl, this small, scared child who had learned to hide her fear behind a teddy bear, would not be left behind. The moment they reached the car, a sense of urgency surged through Ethan's chest. The situation had escalated quickly in his mind, and now he was standing at a crossroads. The parking lot, once just a place for cars to come and go, had transformed into the arena for an important decision. It wasn't about following protocol anymore. It was about trust, trusting his instincts, trusting his ability to recognize danger, and most importantly, trusting that he could make a difference. The little girl, Lily, had sent out a silent cry for help, and it was clear to Ethan that it was no mistake. But now the question lingered. What would he do with the knowledge he had? His eyes locked onto the pair as they approached the blue sedan. The man was focused on the task at hand, oblivious to the fact that he was being watched. He opened the passenger door for Lily, the girl hesitating for just a moment, her small frame lingering by the door as though she were contemplating something, or perhaps hoping for someone to step in. The brief hesitation was all it took for Ethan to make up his mind. This wasn't just about a routine observation anymore. It wasn't about following them until he could make a call to the authorities. It was about acting. It was about making sure the girl was safe now, before she was taken away to God knows where. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his radio, the weight of the decision sitting heavily in his stomach. He could feel the adrenaline beginning to course through his veins as he made the call. Unit 47, requesting backup for a possible child welfare check, he said, his voice steady but filled with the tension of the moment. There was no turning back now. He wasn't sure if he was right, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't let this go. The small gesture in the store had been enough for him to realize that something wasn't right. He wasn't going to let the little girl slip through the cracks, not on his watch. As the car door closed behind Lily and the man started to walk around to the driver's side, Ethan's heart raced faster. He didn't have much time. If he waited too long, they would be out of the parking lot, gone, and he'd be left with nothing but his doubts and his regrets. He had to act. Without thinking twice, he began to walk towards them, his mind focused on one thing, protecting the girl. The closer he got, the more he could feel the gravity of the situation settling on his shoulders. The man had just slid into the driver's seat when Ethan reached the car. He was about to close the door when Ethan cleared his throat and spoke. "Excuse me, sir. I'm Officer Morales." I'm going to need to ask you a few questions. The man's reaction was immediate but nonchalant. He looked up at Ethan with a raised eyebrow, his expression unreadable. Is there a problem, officer? His voice was casual, almost dismissive, as if he was used to being approached by law enforcement. He didn't seem particularly concerned or alarmed. That lack of concern only made Ethan more suspicious. The girl hadn't even looked up at Ethan. She sat in the passenger seat, her hands still gripping the teddy bear tightly, her eyes downcast. I just need to verify a few things, Ethan continued, keeping his voice firm but polite. His eyes flicked over to Lily, who had begun to fidget nervously in the seat, her gaze darting from the man to Ethan. He could see the flicker of something, fear maybe, or perhaps it was a silent plea for help. Either way, it was enough for him to take the next step. The man didn't seem bothered by the request. In fact, he smiled slightly, as though this was just another minor inconvenience. I don't know what this is all about, officer. I'm just taking my niece home. We've got a long drive ahead. Ethan's instincts flared. The mention of a niece didn't sit right with him, especially given how the man had referred to her earlier. He hadn't shown any affection, any tenderness toward the child, and yet now he was claiming to be her guardian. Ethan needed answers, and he needed them quickly. He wasn't going to let this go any longer. I'm going to need to speak with your niece, Ethan said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who knew that this wasn't just a routine check anymore. His gut was telling him that this wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. The man's expression shifted just slightly from casual to guarded. His smile faded, replaced by a look that didn't quite reach his eyes. "She's fine, officer," he said quickly, his voice becoming just a bit more tense. "She's just a little shy. You can't talk to her right now." Ethan stood his ground. "I'm going to have to ask you to step out of the vehicle, sir. I need to make sure that she's okay." At that, the man's demeanor changed completely. He hesitated, his gaze flicking nervously from Ethan to the car door, but he made no move to get out. Instead, he reached for the car keys in his pocket, his fingers brushed against them. But then he stopped, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. There was something about the way he was acting that screamed guilt, and Ethan could see that in the way the man stiffened. There was no more casual indifference in his movements, no more easy confidence. "I'm not going anywhere," the man said, his voice suddenly lower, more defensive. He started the car, the engine rumbling to life with a throaty growl. But before he could put the car in gear, Ethan took a step forward and put his hand on the hood of the car, blocking his path. "Don't," Ethan warned, his voice low but unwavering. He had reached the point where there was no more room for doubt. He wasn't going to let this man drive away with a child who might be in danger. "You need to step out of the vehicle now. If you refuse, I'll be forced to take further action." The man's eyes narrowed, and for a moment Ethan saw something dark flash in his expression, anger perhaps, or maybe something more dangerous. But it was gone just as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the same casual mask he had worn since they first crossed paths. "Fine," the man muttered, throwing open the door and stepping out of the car. His movements were stiff, reluctant. Ethan stood there, watching him carefully. His heart was pounding in his chest, his adrenaline surging. His mind was racing with the knowledge that this was the moment that could define the outcome. If he had misread the situation, if he had overstepped, the consequences could be serious. But if he was right, if the little girl needed him, if she was in danger, then there was no choice. He had to act. "Where's your niece?" Ethan asked, his voice sharper now as the tension between them escalated. He wasn't going to let this man talk his way out of this. He needed answers. The man shifted uneasily. "She's in the car. I told you she's fine. There's no reason for you to get involved. Just let me go." But Ethan wasn't buying it anymore. He couldn't let the man leave with the girl without doing everything he could to ensure she was safe. With a decisive motion, he gestured for the man to move aside. "I'm going to speak with her now." The man stood frozen for a moment, his expression tightening, but finally he stepped back, his eyes glancing toward the car. Ethan opened the passenger door slowly, not wanting to make any sudden movements that might startle Lily. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, and for the first time, Ethan saw the fear that had been hiding behind her quiet facade. She was scared, terrified even, but there was also something else in her eyes, a quiet relief, like she had been waiting for someone to come to her aid. "Hey, there," Ethan said softly, crouching down to her level. "Are you okay?" She nodded, but her grip on the teddy bear tightened, and for a moment she seemed hesitant to speak. Ethan didn't push her. Instead, he just stayed there, his presence gentle, waiting for her to feel safe enough to answer. "My name's Officer Morales," he continued, his voice low and reassuring. "I'm here to make sure you're okay." Lily finally looked at him, and in that moment, Ethan knew he had made the right choice. She didn't have to say a word. The fear in her eyes said it all. She needed help, and he had given it to her. After a long moment, Lily whispered, he's not my daddy." The words were barely audible, but they were enough to confirm what Ethan had suspected. The weight of the situation settled heavily on Ethan's shoulders. He had taken action, and now there was no turning back. The man's lies were unraveling, and Ethan knew that his decision to intervene had been the right one. The immediate aftermath of the confrontation left him feeling a mixture of relief and concern. The relief was for Lily, who was finally safe, but the concern was for what would come next. The situation was far from over. The truth was just beginning to surface. As Ethan drove back to the precinct later that evening, his mind wandered over the events of the day, replaying them again and again. The moment he had first noticed the subtle signal in aisle 12 felt like it had happened only moments ago, though hours had passed. But the weight of what had happened, of what he had done, had not yet fully settled on him. There were moments in an officer's career when the difference between doing the right thing and walking away was measured in the tiniest of gestures, and today it was a child's hand signaling silently for help. That one fleeting moment, so easily missed by anyone else, had become the defining moment of Ethan's shift and possibly of his entire career. He couldn't help but wonder how many other small signs, small moments, went unnoticed every single day. How many people out there silently cried for help and were ignored. Lily's life had already been altered by her one small gesture, and Ethan knew that her future had just changed. Her silent plea, her unspoken cry for help, had not only been noticed but acted upon. Ethan hadn't hesitated. He had followed his gut, pushed past his doubts, and trusted his training. The result had been undeniable. The small but profound difference he had made in Lily's life was something he would carry with him forever. It was a lesson in the power of attention. Sometimes, the most subtle of signs carried the heaviest of meanings. He had learned that day, perhaps more than ever before, that paying attention was not just about spotting the obvious, the overt signs of distress. It was about seeing what wasn't said, reading between the lines, recognizing the things that people often hid. The little girl hadn't screamed for help. She hadn't shouted or run toward him, begging him to save her. Instead, she had quietly made a signal, a small, almost imperceptible movement that, in a different set of circumstances, might have been missed entirely. But Ethan had seen it, and that was the first step toward making sure she would never have to feel that fear again. He thought about the officer he had been when he first started out. Back then, he had envisioned himself in high-stakes situations, responding to calls of gunshots in the night or breaking up major crimes in progress. He had imagined himself as a hero, someone who could always do something dramatic, something that would instantly change the course of someone's life. But the reality of policing had been far different. The day-to-day work was about following protocols, ticking boxes, filling out reports. In the beginning, Ethan had found it frustrating. The excitement he had dreamed of, the rush of saving lives, hadn't come as he expected. Instead, he was often left with a sense of monotony, a feeling that most days were just about keeping the peace rather than making any kind of tangible difference. But now, reflecting on the events of today, Ethan realized that the most significant impact he had ever made in his career wasn't through the dramatic moments he had once envisioned. It wasn't about arresting criminals or chasing down dangerous suspects. It was about something far quieter. It was about seeing the unseen. It was about noticing the small details, the quiet signals that other people wouldn't pick up on, and taking action. That's what had made the difference in Lily's life. It wasn't about grand gestures. It was about caring enough to notice the tiny things that were out of place. Ethan had acted not because he had seen something extreme, but because he had seen something subtle. His ability to notice the small signs that others might have overlooked was what had allowed him to make a difference today. And in the end, that was what truly mattered. In a world where so many people rushed past the details, where the noise of everyday life drowned out the cries for help, Ethan had been the one to listen. He had been the one to act. As he neared the precinct, the lights of the city beginning to fade in the rearview mirror, Ethan thought about Lily again. Her life had changed in the span of a few hours, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan felt a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't just a cog in the machine, filling out reports and answering calls. He was part of something bigger. He was part of a force that could protect the vulnerable, that could give a voice to those who couldn't speak for themselves, and that could notice when something was wrong, even when no one else did. The quiet, subtle shift in Lily's life was just the beginning. In the days to come, she would start to rebuild. She would be safe. She would have a future. But Ethan knew that her future wasn't guaranteed just because he had made the right choice. It wasn't a simple fix. The road ahead for her was still uncertain, still filled with challenges, but in that moment, at least she had been seen. At least she had been given the chance to be heard. The road to recovery for Lily, for anyone in her situation, wasn't an easy one. But it began with that single, simple act of recognition. The moment someone noticed her, the moment someone cared enough to act, was the first step toward a future where she would no longer feel invisible. In that moment, as Ethan sat in his car, the weight of his decision finally sinking in, he realized the larger truth of his work. Sometimes it's the smallest signs that matter the most. In a world filled with noise, filled with distractions and chaos, it's the ability to see the things that are hidden that makes all the difference. It's not the loudest cries that need the most attention. It's often the quietest ones, the ones that go unnoticed, that are the most important. Today, Ethan had seen something that most people would have missed. He had acted on it, and he had changed a child's life. The takeaway was clear. Paying attention matters. It matters in the small moments. It matters when you take the time to listen to the things that aren't said. It matters when you notice what others might overlook. Lily's silent signal, her quiet plea for help, had been a moment in time that could have easily passed by unnoticed, but it hadn't. Ethan had seen it, and because of that, her world had changed. Ethan knew he wouldn't forget this day. He would carry it with him, not just as a badge of pride, but as a reminder that the job wasn't just about following the routine, following the protocol. It was about seeing what others couldn't. It was about noticing the unnoticed, listening for the unheard, and acting when it mattered most. And in that quiet parking lot, with Lily sitting safely in the back seat of another officer's car, Ethan realized that his purpose as an officer had never been clearer. Sometimes the smallest acts of recognition were the ones that saved lives. And that realization, that responsibility, was what would carry him forward in his career from this day and beyond. As he parked the car and stepped out, the night air cool against his face, Ethan took a deep breath. His heart was still racing, but it wasn't out of fear anymore. It was the kind of racing that came from knowing that he had made a difference. He had followed his instincts, and in doing so, he had changed the course of a life. It was a feeling he would carry with him, a reminder of what it truly meant to protect and serve. And as he walked back into the precinct, he knew one thing for certain. Sometimes, the smallest gestures change everything. If you found this story gripping, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more shocking and emotional stories just like this one. Join the HOA Denied Access community, where every untold story matters. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know what you would have done in Ethan's shoes. Stay tuned for more incredible content, and remember, sometimes the smallest signs can change everything. See you in the next video.